So, I was talking about this not months ago. I covered, general hypocrisy. Well, I was pretty specific. I mentioned, the kid, in school who cuts up paper and then gets in trouble for it, but then the teacher's pet of the class does the same thing and gets praised by the teacher for being, so creative and artistic. But another thing I want to talk about is the very common philosophy of rules for thee but not for me. Like, take for example, if I'm the ruler of a small country, let's just a little thought experiment here. I'm the ruler of a small country, and I've decided that on all the roads in my country, no one will be able to go over 25 miles an hour. Except for me. There's no speed limit for me. So I make sure that everybody in my country, very strictly enforced, no one goes over 25 or they will be gravely punished. But I don't want to follow that rule. So I'm going around town doing 90, 120, and I'm just totally exempt. Now, I've mentioned this to some people, and surprisingly, I mean, I almost lost faith in humanity. I already have, but I almost lost it again when I heard this. That doesn't make much sense. But they said, well, that's okay because they're a figure of authority. And I'm thinking to myself, how brainwashed are you? And I think this points to a deeper problem, which is going to lead into a deeper problem. And I'm just going to keep ranting for a while, so expect some bumps here. But it leads to the problem of, I talk a lot about the importance of autonomy, and part of autonomy is thinking for yourself. Losing autonomy is like being trapped in a car with someone who we're in the middle of the interstate highway. It's busy. It's rush hour. I'm trapped in the car with this person, and suddenly they just let go of the wheel. Wheel. Kind of a Fight Club deal now that you think about it, but that's a different deal because that was to serve a point. This is just, I'm trapped in this car with this guy, and he lets go of the wheel, and I have no control. I'm trying, but I can't. That would be a good representation of what it's like for someone to lose their autonomy. So when people don't think for themselves, they just absorb what other people tell them. Right? Like people who don't examine their faith or their philosophy. Like people who don't ever question their life. People who don't ever have an original thought, and that's very broad. What I mean by an original thought is an idea that they came to on their own without having the narrative fed to them beforehand. And when people stop thinking for themselves, they become very easy to manipulate. And that's what would allow for a country where the speed limit is 25, except for the president. And that already is happening around the world. But it's also, I think a large part of it is the Now, you could say there's a bit of a renaissance going around due to the recent surge in, conversation about this, but it's still so small. And the other side is even going further on de-intellectualization. You've probably, if you're anything like me, you've been having a conversation with somebody and you're very passionate about it. This is something you think about, whether it's politics, philosophy, those things are kind of intertwined in a sense, psychology, really anything you can talk about, and anything you're going in depth about. And you hear them say it's not that deep, or you're overthinking. Now, overthinking is a problem, but not everything is overthinking. That term gets thrown around way too often, and often inappropriately. Overthinking is thinking about something that genuinely doesn't have enough depth to be dissected without being detrimental, which I would argue there's not. Oh, it usually happens when somebody with insecurity, is a good example. Overthinking what people think of me, that kind of deal. Constantly trying to examine it, even though I'm not that person. I'm trying to look at myself, see all the flaws, and assume, and try to overthink how I should react instead of just reacting authentically how you actually feel and what's honest to you. I think that's a good example of overthinking. But overthinking gets thrown around way too often. If we're having a talk about, if I'm sitting and I'm trying to talk to somebody about the nature of the universe, where it came from, is there a God? And we have a conversation and I'm pointing out to them, well, on one hand, both science and philosophy hit walls, infinite regression can't explain everything, but then nor can we prove there's a God. There's both science, logic, and religion, science and logic, and then religion hit a wall. I had people once, we're having conversations identical to that, and they say, why do you think about this? Well, number one, you live in a world, don't you want to, sure, this isn't definitive, but you live in a world I can't understand really, and that's just me. I can't understand not wanting to know the nature of it, but also, I think you'd want to, in a world where hypothetically, they're, we can't confirm that there's not something in the end, good or bad, so wouldn't you want to try to examine this and make sure? And you can't make sure. There's nothing 100%, but wouldn't you want to get as close as possible? Now, I personally am, though I kind of considered myself a deist for a while, I'm going more into I've fluctuated between atheism. Well, first I started as a theist, then I became an atheist, a deist, an agnostic, and I'm not sure where I am now. I think I could go either way on is there a creator? I'd say if there's a creator, it's likely passive, but this is something I debate with myself all the time. But if we're having this conversation, this is something you want. I think this is, though in a world where I believe there is no, each person is different, but I think that's you can get as close to being certain as possible. It seems very logical to want to know the nature of your universe, especially when it could affect you in such an eternal way. But yeah, if we get a society, and that goes further, which it is, we're going to have a bunch of people who don't think for themselves, who just accept the given narrative, take things at face level, and, if their favorite celebrity says it, they'll go with it and they'll die for it. Well, maybe not even that. I don't think they have that much commitment, but depends on the person. Maybe they would. It's like a cult, some of them. But, yeah. What was I starting off talking about? Rules for thee, but not for me. With the car, small country, everyone has to go 25 miles an hour except the leader. Rules for thee but not for me is so clearly flawed if we look at it through a level of fairness. And while you could say, hey man, you're an atheist, or you're not sure what you are, but we at least know that I don't believe in objective morality. Well, we don't know necessarily, but because that depends. Not some atheists believe in objective morality, but I personally don't. So you could say to yourself, and you believe that life has no meaning, which would imply that nothing is necessarily true when it comes to these philosophical things, in these spiritual things. You could say, hey man, how do you know that it's not right? But on the other hand, I think if we're going to live in a society, we're already assuming that that's right too. So if you can't prove what's right, you also can't prove what's wrong, but you can flip that backwards, and I don't know how you want to go about doing this, but it just doesn't seem that crazy to me. But, I mean, you're going to have to figure it out for yourself, sure, but essentially, we can't guarantee anything. So if we're going to commit to a structure, it should be I mean, a better solution to that would be every man for himself. So, essentially, if we take it from that angle, you know, even if we can't reach an answer, we at least know that neither you or I, well, from my angle, we know, maybe not yours, we at least know that neither one of us is necessarily right. So if you take this rules for thee but not for me, you're assuming that you're in my view, you're either doing one of two things. You're either assuming that you are worth more than anyone else, which would make no sense from that angle, because if the world is meaningless and we're essentially the same, we're all part of the same collective compost pile, you're no better. Either that, or you're assuming, if you could take an every man for himself and say, well, I worked to get there, I was essentially allowed to do it, or I fought hard enough to do it, that naturally justifies itself. But then you say, well, why? In my view, society is a lie, but if we're going to try it, let's at least pick something where it's not an even playing field, but let's pick, though it probably should be, let's at least pick something, right, where we all collectively benefit. Because even if you manage to work it, you're like, every man for himself, I've crawled to the top of this, I'm in power over everybody, you still lose out in some other things, and some other people, if it's every man for themselves, they're going to come after you too, so you lose something. So I think we should pick something that, if we're going to try this, we should pick something that benefits us all, right? But anyways, got 30 seconds to leave myself more. I've got nothing more to say that I can immediately conjure up, so